Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Villegas, and I'm the Communications Director I Have the Right to. To mark National Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we're launching the third season of our interview series with survivors and allies. The goal of this series is to serve as a resource for fellow survivors, offering connection, encouragement, and insight for anybody navigating their own journey. The idea for these conversations came from a discussion that Chessy had several years ago. She shared that when she was younger, she wished that there had been a place where she could hear from other survivors, people who had walked a similar path and could offer hope, perspective, and solidarity. This series grew out of that wish. We're so grateful to share these stories, and we're excited for you to learn from the incredible individuals joining us this season.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ray Epstein. I am the Youth Engagement and Programs Coordinator for I Have the Right To. So I oversee our internship program and I facilitate programming across the country.
We're so happy to have you here. So, Ray, you've been organizing around sexual violence prevention since you were very young. What first moved you from personal experience into public advocacy?
So when I was in 8th grade, I reported experiencing sexual assault when I was in 7th grade. And the backlash of my peers was immediately so severe and so snowballing that my school and my family agreed it would be best for me to finish the year from home. And my education ended up being limited to very, very few hours, even minutes per day. And because of that, I was just left to sit and kind of fester in my own experience. And my mom noticed me growing more and more depressed and just being surrounded by all of the painful memories without anything to really distract me or empower me. And I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is uniquely a very special place to be able to get involved at a very young age. And my mom really wanted me to see that advocacy work could be something empowering and could be something that transforms an experience into something of impact and of worth. And so she encouraged me to apply to internships in DC, although there weren't many for middle schoolers. I did find one organization that was willing to interview me. It was called Break the Cycle, which is an anti-teen dating violence organization, and they were willing to take me on after I interviewed. And I thought that the whole experience would be me getting coffee for people or doing silly intern things that young people do, but they took me incredibly seriously and they gave me a lot of responsibility. And in that responsibility, I was able to meet so many other survivors who had similar experiences to me and were similar ages to me. And it made me realize that I wasn't alone in this experience of institutional betrayal and retaliation, and also just my isolated experience of sexual violence that I thought was something exclusive to my own experience.
That experience must have been very powerful for you after being so isolated for so long and just being closed off from the world. And there was something that you mentioned, institutional betrayal. And that's a word that we use a lot when we do the work in I Have the Right To. What would you say is your definition of institutional betrayal?
My definition of institutional betrayal would be when an institution or a community is entrusted with someone's experience that may be a violation of policies or of standards that they have in place to protect you, and they mishandle that report. So they go against those policies. They intentionally do not make your safety their priority and instead make reputation or the other person who is the accused or both the priority instead. And that was very much my experience reporting to my school.
It must have been very painful for you. So you stopped going to school and you were isolated from your peers. You said that at one point you wanted to step up of being defined by what happened. How did you navigate that tension between that isolation that you felt and still being called to fulfill the work?
So I went to high school with my abuser. We were in the same school district. So after we were separated for the time that I was on homebound instruction, we kind of reunited in this new environment that was larger and full of more people. And so the speculation and the rumors just hit a larger group of people. And my accusations that were labeled as lies by both my abuser and my community spread very rapidly throughout the school district. And so for me, it was very isolating to be be labeled as this person that was so associated with sexual assault, but in a negative capacity. But also weird for me because outside of school, the only place where I found empowerment and comfort and some sense of belonging was in this work that I never really shared with my peers or my classmates, or I was ashamed of doing because I thought it would just reinforce what everyone believed, which was that I was trying to make my whole personality or my whole life sexual violence related, when really I was just trying to find a way to recover and stop the next person from going through the same thing. But in high school, I really struggled with being transparent with the few friends that I did have in that community about the work that I was doing. And it got to a point where it was so public that I didn't even feel like I could continue that work. And I didn't feel like I had a sense of identity outside of sexual assault. And so when I went to college, I really wanted to find that identity and to leave behind anything that could possibly connect me in this new community of people to sexual violence, because I assumed that if I did anything, even if it was positive, it would turn into this negative snowball that I was so accustomed to for so many years. So I thought I'd try to find something on campus that would be a way of me still having that outlet, but quietly, maybe in the back of a room, in the back of a meeting of some anti-sexual assault advocates that I figured would exist on my campus. And when I got to our club fair, I remember very strategically breaking off from my roommates because I didn't want them to know I was looking for a club for sexual assault survivors, and saying, I'm going to go find the lacrosse intramural team, go talk to them. And they were not interested in that. So they accepted that excuse. And I did about 3 laps at the club fair, and I couldn't find any anti-sexual assault club, even though my university had listed one as existing. And so I was confused, and I kept thinking, oh, I've just missed the table. But I gave up around round 3 and emailed the club's advisor that night when I got back to my dorm, making sure my computer was angled away from my roommate's desk, because I felt so private about being involved in any capacity with just the 2 words sexual assault. And the advisor emailed me back within a week and told me that the club had been defective for the past 4 years. And that to me just felt so wrong, because I realized I need this outlet so badly. And I've already had a chance to meet other survivors. I've already had a chance to be involved in this work. And I still have that craving and that need for reassurance and validation and community. I can't imagine for someone who's been sexually assaulted in college for the first time, or right before going to college, not having had that comfort or validation in their experience or following their experience, having no place to go. And so for me, I had to really reconcile what are my priorities and what are my values and what do I need versus what do I want? And is it more important for me to have this community and be a part of it, and for other people to have this community, than for me to be distanced from the words sexual assault? And to me, it wasn't as important for me to be distanced as it was for that space to exist. And so I got a few people together in my hall and started this organization again called Student Activists Against Sexual Assault. And I was associated with sexual violence very publicly across campus very quickly, because the club grew very fast and very prominently on campus. But I was associated with it in a way that I haven't been familiar with before, which was that it was a positive thing, an empowering thing, and that I was an advocate instead of a victim, or instead of a fake victim who wanted attention, or whatever somebody might have said before. And I learned that it could be this positive and beautiful identity that was fulfilling and empowering, instead of what it had been for me for so many years that made me want to hide.
I think that that's very beautiful. I wanted to ask, because in other interviews before you've mentioned finding I Have the Right To as a book. Did you do that in university, or did you do that as a high school student? How was that first interaction with the organization?
I found it my freshman year of high school, so I struggled a lot with finding any content related to sexual violence, particularly of high school students. The small amount of literature that existed was about, workplace harassment and about college campus sexual assault, because it's so common to happen in college. And so that was beginning to surface, but this was still pre-Me Too, pre-many articles and stories being shared. And so when I would feel alone, I felt like I had nothing to relate to, even though I was slowly learning through my work outside of school that other people did exist, and so commonly and so much among us in private. And I looked desperately on Goodreads, on any platform that I could, just Googling things that probably looked really sketchy, like sexual assault books, stories about sexual assault. And it was almost obsessive, but I found these kind of anchors in a few pieces of media that did exist. And one of those, the first one, was Chessy's book, I Have the Right to. And I would listen to it on tape when I was at school. The taunting was so bad and so intense that I always had headphones on between classes in those transition periods. One, because sometimes I would pass my abuser and he would give me like a look or point at me, and I would just break down. Or sometimes people would shout at me that I was a liar or something along those lines. And so I always wanted to drown out that sound. And I finally found Chessy's book and I heard it in her own voice. And there are literally words in that book that say, "It's not your fault, and I believe you." And I would just listen to it throughout the entire day. I'd listen to it walking home. I'd listen to it while I got ready for school to get me ready for the day and prepared to take on each day. And I would restart it as soon as it was done because it was one of the only things that existed. And Chessy's voice was just this powerful thing for me that reassured me that I would get out of this and I would eventually not be in the same environment that I was existing in that was so terrible and so toxic. And she mentioned in her book that before she testified, she was given a toy knight figurine to keep her strong and protect her. And I think that's what her book has been for so many people, including me. I've always thought of it as this knight and Chessy as this knight that I got to carry with me in my ears and in my body and in my mind because it was so consuming and I could just narrow in and focus on it and drown out all of these horrible things. And I truly feel like it's one of the reasons I'm still alive today.
That is incredible, and I'm so happy that in the midst of such a hostile environment, you found a piece of media, found Chess's book, and it allowed you to continue. I cannot imagine what it must have been. And you said that it showed you hope, the belief that you would one day get out of the environment and succeed and thrive, and you did. And then you went to university and you struggled with the idea of starting the club and going back to the label again and restarting advocacy, knowing that it was a very public decision. I'm very interested in knowing how the process was of recruiting other members and how that process of building the student organization went. What have you learned about why young people want to get engaged and what actually helps students feel powerful and encouraged enough to do the work?
You know, the Prouts are such a big part of starting my club too, and it was the beginning of my first actual encounter with these people that I'd built this parasocial relationship with in my head and in my personal life. I was scared to start this club, and I was scared to be someone so young starting this club who was new to campus. It took about a year to get the approval and the funding to start the organization. And the beginning of my sophomore year, I was very, very hesitant to be someone who I thought was young and maybe not as authoritative as a senior or a junior or as the people who were more involved on campus, asking people to join and to listen to me and my friends about our vision. And I wasn't even sure what our vision was because I didn't know how clubs worked, barely went to high school. So I wasn't very involved. It was, shocking if I stayed the whole day at high school because it was such an unsafe place for me. And so I really had no understanding of how these things worked or how they should be structured. And so I went to our first club fair to table on behalf of SASA without that vision. And people were approaching our table and saying, what do you guys do? And I was just riffing and coming up with things, saying, we'll do fundraisers and maybe we'll have an ice cream social. And the reactions people gave were so off-putting, but so fair and warranted because it's not serious enough to just fundraise and to have ice cream and make a space where people can get to know each other. This issue is too important for that to be all that defines a space like this. And so people were pressing and, saying, well, what else are you going to do? What are you going to do for survivors? And I thought, I don't know. And I don't know how to talk about this without identifying myself as a survivor, right? This was during that kind of transitionary period of trying to figure out how to be an advocate without being a survivor necessarily upfront. And I reached out to people for advice and for help. And I reached out to a documentary filmmaker named Nancy Schwarzman, who directed Roll Red Roll, a film about high school sexual assault that was one of those few pieces of media that really resonated with me. And she said, I think you should talk to Chessy Prout. And she CC'd Chessy on the email. And then Chessy forwarded it to her father, to Alex Prout. And I had suddenly in this inbox access to these two people that in my view had saved my life, but had no idea who I was, but were such a big part of my literally every day. There's a photo my roommate took of my face because this was after the club fair. We were in the dining hall eating French fries and kind of pushing them around on a plate thinking, what am I going to do? And my roommate was part of the club. And I got this email and my face just blew up in this smile. And Alex asked me if I would meet him for coffee, and I did, and I got his advice on how clubs work, on how advocacy works in college campuses, how survivors can balance self-care with empowering advocacy, and it was just the most inspiring and invigorating conversation I've ever had, and it started everything. It gave me a toolkit and a framework to approach this work on my college campus, and I don't know where we would be or what we would have done if I hadn't had that opportunity to speak with him.
You had told me the story before and I've seen the picture and I can see the happiness on your face, and that makes me so happy for you, because so many times young people are told that they're too young, too inexperienced, that they cannot really tackle grown-up affairs, that there is nothing that they can do other than sit and look at what's happening. So I'm happy that you had that partnership and that guidance from them. When you were talking about balancing being an advocate without necessarily being upfront as a survivor, how did you navigate that, and why did you choose eventually to come forward as a survivor?
I think what was really important to me in establishing this organization was not just that I didn't have to be a survivor to do this work, but that anyone in the room didn't have to recognize each other as a survivor or label one another or write someone off as a survivor. I wanted to create a space where people wanted to talk about this issue just for the sake of talking about it. And for me, I realized I was comfortable embracing that identity the second that I was around people who were willing to believe me. And I had never experienced that culture or that kind of community before. But for everyone, that's not necessarily the case. And I knew, my roommates were involved. Some of them haven't experienced sexual violence, and a lot of my friends hadn't, but they were interested in being involved. They were scared, though, to stand up in front of a room of people in a club room named Student Activists Against Sexual Assault, where they felt like it would imply that they were claiming to have had some sort of experience, not just because they didn't want people to think they were claiming to be something they weren't, but because they didn't want people to think that they'd been sexually assaulted. Because there really is that label changes the way that people treat you often. And they didn't want to experience that justifiably. And so my focus then switched from my own discomfort and from how we were going to operate in terms of being a community that does more than ice cream socials on our campus to how can we be a community that creates change and is a safe space for survivors, but also one that when people walk into it, they don't have to claim any sort of label or feel like other people are ascribing some sort of label or experience that they may not feel connected to when they walk in. So how can we make sexual assault every person's problem on this campus, but also every person's initiative for change? And that was really difficult, but it was solvable, I felt like, on our campus through how many young men were willing to get involved in the beginning. My best friend was my neighbor in my dorm hall at first and then became my roommate. And he was, a very masculine looking man that I think a lot of people would identify with who might feel more scared to enter these spaces. He was like 6'4", lots of facial hair, somebody who I think people felt invited by who wouldn't necessarily typically find themselves in these spaces. And so we filled that space with as many people as possible who didn't seem like traditional allies to the sexual assault survivor community. And I think that's what made it a space where people could enter and where so many people could be a part of projects and solutions and initiatives and change without necessarily having had a survivor experience or feeling like somebody was labeling them as having one.
So many people think that sexual assault is a women's issue, that it is something that only women can experience, which is absolutely wrong, but it is also something that only women will want to work in. So what would you say to people that think like this is not a man's issue and we shouldn't involve men in the conversation?
I would say I think sexual assault is so misunderstood just categorically, but especially among men in terms of understanding your own experiences. And it's not men's fault. I think it's that it's not talked about, and vulnerability is an issue, and having conversations about experiences is an issue or is taboo. But sexual assault isn't just when you're alone with someone and rape happens or something very, very severe. Sexual assault is unwanted touching. It's when somebody crosses a line physically. And I think there are a lot of instances that I witnessed in college at parties where women would be trying to kiss guys out of nowhere and the guys would be backing away. And then the women would pressure them and say, you know what, do you not find me attractive? Trying to manipulate them. And I think probably most of those men didn't view that experience as sexual assault. But every time we went out in college, no matter what gender we were, those experiences found us, or they happened, within 5 feet of us, within a small radius in the room, and we all witnessed it. I think it's so easy to write off as being a women's issue because we feel protective of women. Women feel protective of one another, but we should be protective of everyone, and men should be protective of themselves. And it's hard to get to a point where it's safe for them to feel like they can do that. And I don't want to speak for men, but I really think that's misunderstanding, and that disconnect is why often they're not in the room. But I think they've experienced it so much more than a lot of us realize or acknowledge.
One of the things that we see time and time again during our programming is men saying, I didn't know that this could happen to men too. I didn't know that this was a thing. I thought that this was normal, and nobody had these conversations with me. And I think that that's really, really heartbreaking because it's a reality for all of us, but only a group of us have the tools and the language and the support that we need, even if it's not enough most of the time. So I think that including men in the conversation makes a huge change and a huge impact. And you were saying it yourself, just having men within the club completely changed the environment that you were creating. And I was wondering, among the many things that your organization did, you also did education. And so how did the program begin, and how did you start teaching other people about the subject?
So we initially started as meeting twice a week, or bi-weekly, every other week, as a club. So opening up our meetings to every single person on campus who would be willing to attend. And we did that for all of the years that I was at Temple that we were organizing. And we'd talk about bystander intervention. We would talk about, how culture and rape culture are normalized within media, in songs, in movies. We would do Jeopardy nights. We would do partnerships with other organizations, with sororities, and then fraternities, where building out actual kind of curriculum that was structured in feedback and practice and revision really began. So that first year, I knew one of the 3 things that I sat down with myself after meeting with Alex Prout and coming up with 3 action items for myself was I wanted to do a screening of a film called The Hunting Ground with the fraternities and have some sort of discussion about it, because I knew my brother had done that as part of his orientation at his university. And I remember hearing him have conversations with us at home that were something he would never have discussed before. He was realizing things. He was understanding things about sexual violence and consent and institutional betrayal that he had never encountered before. And so I wanted to bring that same experience into the fraternity culture at my university. And we reached out to the president of the Interfraternity Council on campus, and he was very open and willing to participate in something. I think partly because the sororities that year had disaffiliated from the fraternities because of how rampant sexual assault had been and how unaddressed it had been. And so I think the fraternity saw this as an opportunity to bounce back from that disaffiliation, to learn something and to do better so that they could spend more time together again. They just could start working together again. And so we organized this screening and discussion afterwards and survey for feedback to see what they had learned, what they were taking away, what didn't resonate, and what did. And we found that for most of us being women running the workshops, a lot of people weren't participating when we asked them questions. And I think it's because we came in with this kind of two-dimensional mindset and view of the fraternities as enablers of rape culture or participants within it, instead of as individuals with their own experiences. Likely some of them have been statistically sexually assaulted, if not hazed, if not violated in some other way, if not just men who want to do better and men who are well-intentioned. And I think they felt that in the room. And we felt it when they weren't participating. We felt their reaction to our stereotypes and our assumptions and biases. And so we had their feedback that was very minimal. Somebody even answered a question just with the word nah. And we thought, okay, we need to change this. We need to come back with something different. And we thought, how much better would it be if leaders from their own community were facilitating this conversation and we were just equipping people with the tools to have the conversation itself, to have this workshop. And so we brought in the pledge educators or new member educators. They're the people in charge of all the people who are rushing fraternities, and the presidents, and said, okay, we want you to have these breakout discussions. Here are the questions with the people who are rushing your fraternity after we watch this film. And the participation difference was immense. We had to, limit who we were calling on because there were so many more hands. And the feedback was then the movie is too long. We're sitting in this room for too long on a Saturday. And so we clipped the movie and shortened it to about 30 minutes of what we thought was the most important, even though all of it, of course, is relevant. And then it was just not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but the attention span went up. People weren't anymore watching a football game on their phone in the back row or playing Clash of Clans, which we noticed in the first two screenings. They were participating. They were even disclosing sometimes afterwards to us. They were so engaged. And I think they felt compelled then to get engaged beyond that. They started coming to our biweekly meetings voluntarily. They started asking us if they could organize fundraisers with us. They started coming up to our tables when we'd have bake sales and bringing all of their friends. And there was just such a significant cultural shift when we started treating the people that you usually view as bad actors or as the enemies of an issue as human beings with the capacity to have an impact on their communities, because truly those men are leaders on their campus, and we treated them like they were villains.
So as a woman working on the space, it's often very easy to put people into black and white boxes and be like, oh, you are evil and you're good, and that's it. And that's something that we're trying to resolve with aspiration masculinity. And the core of our curriculum is that is you are a whole human being with attributes, with faults, and it is a matter of showcasing a positive way of applying your leadership, your experiences as a man to become an active member of society, a positive member of society that can then be an upstander, that can then actually change the issues that we're presented with. So you had an incredible group in university. It was nationally recognized. You were able to fundraise and absolutely change the culture, which is a huge, huge achievement. What made you then decide to continue with the work, and how did you find us again after all of those years in your university?
I think I knew from the first time that somebody told me that a space like ours made a difference in their lives, that this was what I had to do with the rest of my life, because there was no feeling that was so fulfilling as that, and so empowering. And it just felt so full circle, because most of my life that I've known at this point has been after being sexually assaulted. I had very few years of life where I was becoming someone, consciously, where I hadn't experienced abuse. And I didn't know how that would affect me. I didn't know who I would become. And I was ashamed and disappointed by that, because I had aspirations and passions at a young age beforehand that I thought would turn into my career and to my future. Like, I loved filmmaking. I loved travel and adrenaline, and I thought I would love to make videos about travel someday, or I'd love to be a filmmaker as Chessy has become. I thought I maybe would be a writer. I loved creative writing and poetry. But I've realized that although what happened to me was so terrible, the career and path that it's put me on has been such a gift because I don't think there is anything more fulfilling than what I do today. And I can't imagine being as fulfilled in what I would have done as what I am doing. And so the way that I got connected to I Have the Right to was my senior year of college. I was reached out to during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so about a year ago today. And I was asked to do a fundraising video for the organization. So I did, happily, of course, because it felt, again, very full circle. And we stayed in contact. And when I graduated, I did my first training as a kind of shadowy with our executive director, with Katie Ship, in San Diego. And I thought, oh my God, I'm flying to another part of the country to do a training. This is like so surreal and full circle with this organization that has brought me so much positivity and so much hope for so many more years than they've known I existed. And within about I think 3 weeks, 4 weeks of that, I was offered a job. And so that brought us here today. And I can't see myself doing anything, different.
I remember back then when we reached out to do the video and you said yes, I was like, yay, we got it! Because you were such an amazing inspiration for all of us. You are the example of what we're trying to teach people when we go to colleges. Yes, this issue exists, but there are things that can be done when you put your minds together and when you work collectively as a society to change. And so I remember just being so excited when you joined us. And now I cannot imagine a world in which you don't exist and you're not working with us, because you've brought so many ideas. You've brought so many wonderful things to our team. And now I want to ask you, as somebody who's working now with I Have the Right to, what have you learned about the work that we're doing? What gives you hope about what we're doing?
I think every school environment gives me hope in a different way, since we work with so many different communities. And even when it's all co-ed schools, they're all different. But every single time that I've done a training, I have either had somebody come up to me and say that they've never heard anyone validate their experience like that before. And in addition to, I've seen somebody say, I should change the way that I'm treating somebody, or I should change the way that I'm acting in the world. And it's not them saying that they've sexually assaulted someone. It's during like a boundaries training or a healthy relationships training where we're talking about ways that we should treat each other and how we deserve to be treated. And every single time I watch a child say something like they're watching their experience be validated or they should change their behavior, I know that the people that are going to exist in the world, in college where I went, where the culture had to be interrupted there, won't need that intervention and will pass that on to the people that they meet and will pass it on to future generations. And how can that not give you hope? I mean, to watch a room of hundreds of people, of 50 people be impacted in that way, that ripple effect is going to be so, so tremendous and strong. I can't even imagine how many people, besides, the 40,000 that we've interacted with, have been touched and impacted beyond that just because of those trainings. Because people start talking about it when we give them the tools and the equipment and the language to have conversations that aren't taboo, that aren't scary and uncomfortable and unapproachable. And I just can't imagine how many people have been able to do that since then. So even though sometimes it's hard, right, to see people who remind me so much of myself, who have been sexually assaulted at a young age, to work with children who've been assaulted or who are in communities where they know someone who has been, it's more fulfilling than anything. Because if one person in my community had had access to resources like that, I don't think I would have experienced half of the things that I did. It was an education issue. It was a rape culture issue of this is how you're supposed to treat allegations. You're supposed to assume someone is lying because that was all anybody knew. That wasn't true. But the only reason I knew that was because I worked for these organizations and had access to these special resources that we don't get in school. So knowing that thousands of people are getting it is the most hopeful thing I think I'll ever encounter.
If you could look at our org in 10 years, what is your hope for I Have the Right to? Where do you see us in the future?
My hope would be, and I think this is realistic at the rate that we are growing, is that every student has the chance to encounter some of our programming. Because again, just knowing that if one person had access, they might tell a friend, and they might tell a friend, or they might intervene when a joke happens, or they might intervene when somebody calls someone a liar. And I would hope that we could bring I Have the Right to citywide to all of the cities in our country and also outside of our country. I think we should be international, and obviously we're starting to become international. But I think everyone deserves and has the right to resources like this. And so if we can have citywide summits and work with schools who have the funding or cities that have the funding to expand the audience that we are able to reach and make sure that everyone can come together, can meet one another, and have those experiences in a broader community than just their school, which I think is realistic, we will change so quickly the minds of so many people, the attitudes and beliefs of so many people, and not because they were wrong, but because they've never learned not to say the things that they're saying or to have those viewpoints, right? I really truly don't believe most of it is malicious. I think they don't have access to information that would inspire them to do differently, because that's the only reason I act differently.
You said at the beginning how heartbreaking it was to encounter the institutional betrayal at the level that you did. I'm wondering, what would you say to school administrators? What argument would you present to them of why having us at their school is so important? Not only for the students, but for the teachers themselves, for the administrative personnel that attend our trainings. Why is it so important for them to, as grown-ups, to listen to what we have to say?
I think when we talk about how people are raised with this culture of disbelief, of discrediting, those children become adults and they become teachers and they become parents and they become administrators. Those attitudes don't always go away or fade or change with time. If anything, they're usually reinforced by the culture that we exist in. And so I challenge teachers as people that try to instill a healthy sense of curiosity in their students. I think that's part of what being a teacher is, part of what being a good administrator is, to question their own beliefs, to be curious, to be excited about new information and about evidence-based information, because that's what education is. That's what academia is. And I think what we do is so relevant to what teachers try to instill characteristically and values-wise in their students. And we should all be curious, and we should all consider ourselves as students of the world and people that need to learn more. I need to learn more about this issue. I always will. Even the experts will always have more to learn. There will always be more research. And so I challenge them in that sense to have a curiosity that is healthy, to be open to changing their minds, because that is what being a teacher is to me, but also because they have the power to change their communities. And that should be something that is invigorating and exciting and reason enough to participate. I know that institutions are financially and for so many other reasons incentivized to avoid these topics. But if enough of them came together and decided collectively to address this issue the way that they're willing to tackle other social issues besides sexual assault, which are two buzzwords that just have this negativity and tabooness and untouchableness attached to them, they could change the entire attitude of a nation. If they just were all willing to participate in these campaigns of awareness, to invite people into a conversation, I am 100% sure it wouldn't be this scary, financially disastrous thing for them to discuss and talk about in their environment. It just takes you making that decision to be a part of the solution. And it is happening. I think educators should know we're in schools, right? We're in schools weekly. And so some schools are making that leap and that decision to be on the right side of history. And so right now the question is, will you be on the right side, or will you be the last ones to join the conversation? Because other schools are leaders already on this issue, and you have a chance to choose which you will be.
I love that. I love that statement. This is something that happens. This is something that will keep happening. We're doing something to prevent it from happening. And it is a choice. It is a matter of choice. And regardless of where you stand in terms of knowledge and in terms of willingness, if you don't do something to prevent it, if you don't educate your students, if you don't educate the parents, if you don't educate the teachers, then the issue will continue to happen and it will snowball continuously. What would you say to either a younger Ray, or a younger survivor that feels alone and isolated from the world now that you've lived through it and you're here on the other side?
Two things I would say, and I said this on my podcast episode with you all actually before I started working for you, was there is a sense of urgency in survivorship and recovery in the aftermath of trying to find something that will fix everything. And we can put all of our eggs in one basket, and often we kind of hone in on this is the solution. If this thing happens, I will be okay. And it's important to remind ourselves to interrupt that pattern of thought, because we will just keep chasing things that will not fulfill us and make us whole again. My advice to survivors would be to sit down with yourself in a place that you feel peaceful, in a place that you feel safe, and think to yourself, make a list, what will make me feel whole or closest to whole again that I can feel? Because it might not be aligned with what that urgent sense of I need this to feel justice is. We live in a world that unfortunately those pathways to justice aren't always accessible or achievable, or are more often than not achievable. And so coming up with ways to fulfill ourselves again, to feel regulated, to feel safe, is the most immediately important thing that we can do to recover. And I wish that I had focused on that instead of focusing on things that were unachievable for myself. I lost the opportunity to go to graduation when I was in 8th grade because my school banned me from coming. And I thought that would have been my opportunity to prove to everyone that I was surviving, that I wasn't a victim, that I was okay, or I was going to be okay, and that they could not define me. And so I was dead set on crossing the stage at my high school graduation where he would be again. And I was miserable at this school, but I refused to transfer to another place because I thought that meant he would win. But the truth is that I was losing so much every day being in that unsafe environment, being in an environment where I was terrified that I would be hurt again, being in an environment where people were hurling insults at me in the hallway. It wasn't worth it. But I had this vision of crossing that stage. And the reality is, his last name was right after mine. And I probably would have never made it onto that stage, even if I had gotten to that day, because he would have been right behind me. And I can guarantee I would have been hiding in the bathroom the entire time and missed that moment. But this unrealistic, but very visceral and urgent need to be a part of that kept me at that school for almost 3 years. And I finally, in my junior year, thought, I can't do this anymore. I'm not safe here. And even though it felt like I was caving in or giving something up, I was so much happier in an environment where I wasn't panicked every day. And so I challenge you as a survivor, even though it is not fair, to consider what will make you feel whole and safe, and put that above all else, because that's what's important. When you lose your autonomy, when you lose your sense of safety, truly one path to justice that we often don't think about is returning to that resting state, returning to a place where we feel safe. That's more fulfilling than we give it credit for. And I couldn't have known that until I was in an environment where I was safe, which took so long, but I felt better then.
Thank you. That is very powerful. I think that my last question would be, what is your I have the right to statement?
I would say especially because I reported as a minor, it felt like I lost so many rights and so much of my autonomy in the aftermath of being assaulted. And I felt violated at so many different steps in the reporting process, even when somebody was trying to help me and had my best interests in mind. I felt like I was out of the loop, like I wasn't consulted, like decisions about my safety were being made about me without my opinion or the weight of my opinion. And so I would say that as a minor and as somebody who experiences sexual assault at a younger age, I have the right, and you have the right, to weigh in on the decisions that are made about your body, about your safety, and about your vision of justice. Because the only way that we can reinstate and reinstill autonomy and control after it's been taken away in an instance of violence is to allow that survivor to be a part of the decision-making process. Even if it feels like they might be too young, at least explaining it to them, at least involving them in that decision process, or letting them have some sort of say or opportunity to argue what is right right for them is so important. And I didn't feel like I had that right.
Thank you so much, Ray, for sharing your story with us and for talking to us about your work and what gives you hope. I feel deeply moved and deeply proud of the fact that we're working together every single day. You are a source of inspiration and a source of hope for me and for every other single member of the team. And I am so happy that we were able to come together to create this amazing work that we're doing. So thank you.